we can.
I know darn well we can work it out. Oh, yes, we can. I know we can. Yes, we can. And why can't we if we want to? Yes, we can.
I know we can make it work. I know we can make it if we try.
Oh, yes, we can. I know we can.
Great gosh, your body.
Yes, we can. I know we can.
Thank you for joining me, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for allowing us into your home. Yes, we can with Pastor Sherman D.Manning. My special guest today is Clinton E. Galloway. He is the Chief Operating Officer of Drum Capital Corporation, which is a small broker-dealer that specializes in providing equity capital for developers. They operate as a private equity firm that focuses on deep value, turnaround, distressed, and special situation investing in the North America lower middle market. He has also authored 2 books. One of his books is called Anatomy of a Hustle. Cable Comes to South Central Los Angeles. Check that name out, Anatomy of a Hustle. Look it up on Amazon.com. And his second book is called What Did You Think Was Going to Happen? And I will allow him to elaborate on what both of those books are about coming up. I want to give special thanks to Matthew Amhofer, Frank Gooch, and all of those who are sponsoring this podcast. If you would like to be a part of sponsoring the podcast, go to YesWeCanWorshipCenter.org. Remember, we house the homeless, we feed the hungry. Don't just watch the podcast. Sit down today and send a donation. You can go to YesWeCanWorshipCenter.org. Click donate now and send an instant donation to help us do the work that we're doing. Now, take a look at this show. Thank you for joining me, ladies and gentlemen. I've already introduced my special guest, Mr. Clinton Galloway. And as I told you a moment ago, he has authored 2 books. One is titled Anatomy of a Hustle, Cable Comes to South Central Los Angeles. And the other is titled What Did You Think Was Going to Happen? Mr. Galloway, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Pastor. It's a pleasure to be here.
Pleasure to have you. Listen, I've already introduced you, but for my audience, many of whom might not know who you are, do us a special favor and tell me who you are.
Well, my name is Clinton Galloway. I'm a CPA in Los Angeles, out of Marina del Rey, and I've been involved with accounting and financial services for the last 35 years with various investment banking firms and with various brokerage firms. So I do a lot of things, and the books are about an issue that my brother and I had in developing cable television for the South Central community early in the mid to 1980s and the early 1990s.
Okay, before we get to the book, if I may, the book, to explain to my audience what Mr. Galloway does on a daily basis in layman's terminology. Some of us are not financial wizards like you are. So what is a typical day in the life of Mr. Galloway like?
I basically do business management for people in the entertainment industry. Mm-hmm. I handle their financial affairs and get their money and pay their bills and oversee their investments. Mm-hmm. So that's pretty much what I do on a day-to-day basis, is really oversee clients and their financial services and the financial management of these people who are, again, not necessarily on-air people, but producers and writers and things like that in Hollywood.
Okay. And to the books, which is what we're here to talk about. I know you've sent them to me, and I will read them with deliberate speed and then have you back. But which book did you write first?
I wrote Anatomy of a Hustle first.
Tell me about it.
That book I wrote in 2012.
Okay. Tell me about it.
And the book was basically a layout of how systemic and institutional racism worked in the city of Los Angeles. Mm-hmm. My brother got involved with cable television as early as 1979 when he saw what cable television could mean to a community. Okay. And we put in applications to the city to get licenses, and they simply turned them down. They turned down everybody who was black, but nobody other than black people.
Wow.
So it was an issue where we felt it was important because cable television was the new technology at that time, and it would become the prime technology that would exist in America for at least a decade.
Right.
So South Central community was basically locked out. They were segregated in 1979 by the city of Los Angeles, and that's undocumented, highly documented. And they were not allowed to have cable television until the late 1980s. So 10 years went by where everybody else had access to technology, but the South Central community never did have access to technology until cable became a secondary institution.
And what kind of excuses were they giving when they turned down the application? I mean, they had to say something. What did they say?
They said things like, we don't like your programming. We don't like how you're going to build your system. We don't like basically you. That's what it came down to.
Okay.
The issue came down to, we were approached by people in City Hall and said if we gave them a part of our company, they'll be willing to allow us to do business.
Wow.
It wasn't an acceptable alternative for us, and we told them we couldn't do it. So we had to pursue it on our own.
And were these city councilmen? What kind of people
City
were
councilmen, yes.
Okay.
I'll mention specifically Robert Farrell and David Cunningham,
Okay.
specifically, because they came to me and said it. They came to my brother and said it. And that's how I got involved, was they threatened my brother. So I got involved because I was a financial person. It required a lot of money, and we were willing to put up a lot of money.
And what is your brother's name, may I ask?
Dr. Carl Galloway.
And what does he tell me a little bit about him as you
Dr.
continue?
He passed maybe 6-7 years ago.
Rest in peace.
But he was a doctor in South LA. He was working in the community, and when he saw what cable television meant and what the information could be to provide to our community and to educate people about what was going on medically, financially, and morally, how we develop the moral values of our children will be determined by the media that was available.
So he was a medical doctor.
Yeah, he was a medical doctor.
Okay.
And he worked in St. Francis Hospital in the emergency room for a number of years, and he saw what was going on in South Central.
Right.
Past violence that has existed. So with that going on, he said, hey, let's get involved with this because we have a chance to change it.
Okay.
No one in City Hall knew what cable television was when we came there.
Wow.
So they were basically, it seems like it's going to work, but if it's going to work, we wanted you to pay us. It wasn't an acceptable thing for us. We weren't willing to pay people to do business because, one, it was in violation of the law.
Right.
And we were not interested in violating the law, so I held too many licenses to get involved with criminal activity.
So were these basically bribes that they were asking you to give them?
Yes, basically extortion and bribes.
Wow.
I mean, there was no secret about it. They had no talent. They had no money.
Right.
So all they could offer us was, we'll allow you to come through and do it.
Wow.
Our strong suit was we managed to get one councilman who supported us. His name was Gilbert Lindsay. And Gil Lindsay was the councilor of the Great Ninth District for a number of years. And he said to us, hey, you guys don't have enough money to matter to me because I have downtown and all the buildings. But in all his years there, he had never seen a black company come forward who could do a $50 million deal in the black community and be able to put the money up. So we were able to do it, and so he supported us.
And may I ask how you all were able to get this kind of money in the 70s?
I came out of the investment banking industry. I was working in the investment banking industry for Smith Barney in Beverly Hills. I worked for a major international CPA firm before I went there.
Okay.
So we had access to capital. Plus, we had a number of doctors. My brother was a doctor.
Right.
And we had access to a number of doctors who had capital. And we had access to entertainers who had capital. Because, again, being in the investment banking industry, I was meeting people who had money.
Right.
That's the only way you're going to meet people in the investment industry.
Right.
They've got money, and they came and said, hey, we want to do something useful in our community. And it seemed like an ideal opportunity to take the capital that was available and make it do something productive for the community. And that's what we tried to do. I had skills, my brother had skills, and the people we brought about had skills. So we tried to do it in a way that would benefit the community, allow the community to speak to itself, as opposed to someone from the outside speaking for the community. That was important to us. If we took the issues that we thought were important in the community and dwelt on them, we could solve some of these issues. Medical issues were a key element because my brother had seen the medical problems that existed when people didn't have medical information to make decisions with.
Wow. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be right back after this. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you're enjoying the show. Please remember, if you would like to keep positive programming like this coming into your home, what we need you to do are a few things. Number one, tell somebody about it. Tell somebody about it. Tell your friends about this brand new podcast and the great work that God is allowing us to do here. This is not my church. This is not a church program, but it is a positive podcast, and I am a pastor. Shameless plug. Every Friday night, 10306 Avalon. 10306 Avalon, 130 Avalon. We have a special church service for the homeless at 7 o'clock p.m. You are more than welcome to join us there. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, go to YesWeCanWorshipCenter.org. I'm hoping that some millionaire, some billionaire out there somewhere will see this podcast and decide to see into it, sow into it, send their tax-deductible donation today. We need your help. Now, take a look at this. Thank you for joining us. We're in a fascinating discussion with Mr. Clinton Galloway, who is a CPA, and he's currently with Drum Capital Corporation. So let me ask you, Mr. Galloway, Mayor Tom Ratley, did you approach him concerning what was going on at
Yes.
that time?
We approached him and we sat in his office and talked about it.
And how did
He
that
had a
go?
deputy by the name of Bill Elkins in those days. And Mayor Bradley was one of the people who was adamantly against us because he had a group of people he wanted us to include in our company who had no skills whatsoever. Again, the mayor told us that if you gave my friends 1/3 of your company, I think we can make something happen. His friends had no skills and no money, and we were not interested in bringing on people who didn't have skills or money to help make this happen. I sat in the mayor's office, and I was called a nigger in Tom Bradley's office to my face.
By whom?
People talk about racism. I've never had a person call me a nigger in a major office like that.
And who was the person that said that?
Bill Elkins, his chief deputy at that time.
Wow.
And the mayor was sat in the room also. The mayor was in the room. Danny Bakewell was in the room. Plenty of people were in the room.
Did Danny Bakewell speak up?
No, Danny didn't say. Danny was on the other side. Danny wasn't going to speak up. And I
and
never
the mayor
found Danny
did-
was a businessman.
And the mayor didn't speak up?
The mayor didn't say anything. But
So,
he allowed us to be called niggers, and I wasn't very pleased with it. And my brother wasn't pleased with it.
so let me ask you, would you say, do you think, based on your experience, and we're not trying to besmirch anybody, but we're having an open conversation, and everybody's entitled to their opinion, and you're telling me your truth. So my question to you is, did you leave with the impression that Mayor Tom Bradley was corrupted, or do you think he was just biased and trying to?
I think he was corrupted. I think when a person tells you you have to take my friends in to have a part of your company, and they're not putting up any money, no skills, no ability, and they're telling you this is a major industry. This is a major industry, a multi-billion-dollar industry being developed, and you're telling us we have to take people who we don't even know, who happen to be your friends, who have no skills whatsoever in what we're doing. That to me seemed like basic corruption. And it followed the years that followed after that. Because we went on 3 years in the city applying for a license. It was only after they didn't give us a license that we decided we would have to sue them in federal court. And that's how we ended up at the United States Supreme Court.
And who was your attorney?
We had the largest cable television company, Farrow and Shieldhouse and Wilson out of Oakland,
Okay.
were our attorneys.
And
No one in Los Angeles would touch the case because they were all compromised because they all had contracts to do legal work for the city. So major firms like Pillsbury Madison and Sutro or Melvin and Byers, they wouldn't touch our case. So we had to go out of the city to get an attorney who would handle it. And Farrow, Shieldhouse, and Wilson had won a U.S. Supreme Court case in cable previous to ours. So when we got them, we were very pleased because they were the top plaintiff cable company attorneys in the United States at that time. And they came on and they won the United States Supreme Court verdict for us. We won a unanimous Supreme Court verdict.
wow.
But the city of Los Angeles simply said, we're not going to obey the Supreme Court. And when a city tells you we're not going to obey the Supreme Court when it comes to black people, in fact, we've got a problem. And that problem continues to exist.
So what ended up happening after you take a case to the United States Supreme Court, the highest court in the land, you win, and then the city says we're not going to follow the law. Who was the mayor at that time?
Tom Bradley was still.
Still Mr.
This was
Bradley.
1986, and Tom Bradley was still the mayor.
Okay. So
And so we had a judge by the name of Consuelo Marshall, who had been appointed by Judge Jimmy Carter at the request of Tom Bradley. So she was clearly biased, and she simply held our case for 6 years. We never had a trial. We were not allowed to have any trial or any public hearings. We did not even have a public hearing. All hearings were held in her chambers
Wow.
about this case. So she hushed it up, kept it quiet, and for 6 years, we had a Supreme Court verdict, but we could not do what the Supreme Court said that we could do, which was to build a cable television system in our own community. And that was what the key element was. Without being able to do that, we could not communicate and provide the ability to get content programming developed in Los Angeles. Although we had all the talent here, we couldn't get it done because we did not have the resources to allow us to distribute it.
And so what ended up happening, Mr. Galloway?
Well, in 1992, the judge said, yes, I agree. The Supreme Court has ruled that your rights are being violated, and for your rights being violated for 10 years. And the rights of 500,000 people in South Central Los Angeles were being violated at the same time because you can't separate out my rights from their rights.
Right.
So these rights were being violated for 10 years. She said, I'll give you $1 for spending 10 years, 13 years fighting this battle. I'll allow you to have $1. And that was her judgment. She couldn't give less than $1 because you had to give something when you won a civil rights case in federal court.
And who
And
was
she
this
would
judge?
not allow us to go to a jury to get the actual damages.
And
We
who-
had a top economist in the United States who calculated damages for us.
And who
of
was
what we
this
had
judge?
lost by being locked out.
Who was the judge?
Consuelo Marshall,
Same judge. Okay.
black federal judge, and she had had the case since 1983. It was when she dismissed it in 1983 that we appealed it. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled unanimously against her. The United States Supreme Court ruled unanimously against her. And despite that, she took the case and simply held it, did nothing with it for 6 years. And we could not do anything unless she allowed us to get into the system. The city said, we're not going to comply with the court because although we're violating your rights, we have a judge who says we don't have to do anything. That's what happens when you get to a federal judge and you find a black federal judge, a black mayor, 3 black councilmen, and they're all working against the black community. And so that was a surprise to me. I didn't think that was how it really worked. But LA is like that. You don't think it's like it is, but it really is. It's a racist and corrupt city.
And so did she award legal fees, attorney's fees?
Yes, the attorneys got a little over $1 million. She had to pay them their fees because, again, when you're the winner, and their fees were really in the range of $2 to $2.5 million. But she said, I'm only going to give you $1 million because I don't want you to be, taking advantage of this. So they got $1 million for their legal fees. The city had spent about $10 million in legal fees and various fees to fight us because they had to bring in attorneys out of Washington to handle this case.
Wow.
Their attorneys were not qualified to handle a legal matter of this nature.
And so this judge was clearly compromised and biased. So after this $1 judgment, which to me is just quite frankly insulting, what did you all do after that?
Well, we were preparing to appeal the case and appeal the judgment of the judge. And in 1993, the Congress of the United States passed a law. This law was being passed at the behest of Joe Biden at that time. He was a U.S. Senator out of Delaware. The law basically said, if your civil rights are violated in the cable television industry by a city or any government, you can never collect damages for having your rights violated. So what it really meant is, if your rights are violated, you can never get your rights back because we've decided you can never get damages for having lost your rights. And if that's the case, that was an act of Congress passed and signed by Bill Clinton. Joe Biden was the leader of passing this legislation.
Okay.
So in 1994, he passed the 1994 Criminal Crime Act, which, again, penalized black people. We had the major case in the United States pending about litigation for cable television and the corruption. Corruption was rampant in the cable television industry. It was rampant in New York. It was rampant in Los Angeles. One of the borough presidents in New York killed himself because he got caught with corruption in cable television.
Wow. I think I remember reading about that. Did you ever eventually build a cable television station?
No, we could never build because we'd never get a license to build it. You had to have an approval from the city of Los Angeles and the Department of Water and Power to use the public right-of-ways that were available to be used. There was plenty of room on the public right-of-ways. They simply said, we're not going to allow you to do it. They didn't have an excuse other than one of their excuses was, if you put another wire up there, it may be what we call visual blight. People will see that and feel it's bad. It's destroying the nature of the sky here. That was dismissed, and that was ridiculous. But basically, they said, we're not going to allow you to do it, and that we don't have to have an excuse because we've got a federal judge who's not going to allow you to do it, and therefore, there's nothing you can do. Without a license to build, we can send the police to stop you at any time.
Well, 20 or 30 years later, have you ever contemplated revisiting this issue?
Immediately after that happened, the final decision was made in 1993 when the Congress decided that we could never get damages. Therefore, you could never litigate this matter. In 1994, both my brother and I got extremely sick. I required brain surgery in 1994.
Wow.
My brother contracted leukemia. They gave my brother 1 year to live in 1994 because he had acute leukemia. He lived for 15, 16 more years, but his life was never the same. He couldn't really do everything he wanted to do. But our focus at that point was really the family, our families, and trying to make sure his children were protected, and we had the resources necessary to protect him during his downtime and his health issues.
He was no longer.
I got over my brain surgery after a year. But then again, after you've gone through brain surgery and leukemia, all these little issues about, cable and all these things seem secondary.
Right.
I gave thanks to God for allowing me to get through that.
Amen. Amen. Was your brother ever able to continue practicing as a physician?
He continued practicing for some years. And, again, it was off and on because there would be years where he couldn't work at all because he was too sick. And we went to every major organization, MD Anderson, the Mayo Clinic. We all went to all these organizations to try to get treatment. But there was never any resolution. They would do it so he could live another 2 or 3 years. Then that medicine would wear off. Then we'd get another medicine. He could get it. And at the end, no more medicines were available. And he ended up passing in 2008.
Rest in peace. And
that was when I decided.
His last leukemia?
Thing to me before he passed was to tell me to write this book and tell the people what happened.
And he
The
had
black,
leukemia.
he had leukemia.
It's interesting to me that he died from leukemia, and the name of your book is Anatomy of a Hustle. One of the books I read in the past was by a guy by the name of Norman Cousins, who also
Okay.
had leukemia, and it was called The Anatomy of an Illness.
Okay.
Have you heard of that?
Yes, I have.
Okay, all right.
It was a good book, actually.
It
I actually
was.
read it.
And the person who gave me the book personally was Zig Ziglar, believe it or not. And I'll tell you
Okay,
that story
cool.
some other time. But to this day, I still take a lot of vitamin C because of reading that book. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm with Mr. Clinton Galloway, a fascinating guest, and we'll be back right after this. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you're enjoying this show with this powerful, powerful man, Clinton Galloway, who was referred by one of my friends. If you have any interesting show ideas, people that you think I should have on this podcast, just give me a call. 213-858-2608 is our phone number. Remember, the primary goal of my church is to be a unique, different kind of church. We're not regular sing a song, preach a sermon, raise a lot of money type church. We house the homeless. We feed the hungry. I'm trying to get together an army. Let me say that differently. God is going to get an army of volunteers to meet at my church every Friday night at 7 o'clock p.m. and get your marching orders, because we got a males race going on. Someone's going to win. And when they win, they're going to need volunteers. So we're starting the Big Brother, Big Sister program for the homeless at our church. And we need your help to get it done. See me at 7 o'clock p.m. at my church, 10306 Avalon, YesWeCanWorshipCenter.org. If you'd like to sponsor the podcast, if you'd like to help us feed the hungry, house the homeless, right now, go to YesWeCanWorshipCenter.org. Finally, let me say this. Some of you don't donate because you can't send $5,000. You can't send $25,000. Every donation, if it's $5, it will make a difference. It will help us to take care of the least of these, our brothers. Now, let's get back to the show with Clinton Galloway. Take a look. Okay, so unpack that book for me. Thank you for joining me, ladies and gentlemen. My guest is Mr. Clinton Galloway, and he is the author of Anatomy of a Hustle. Cable news comes to South Central Los Angeles. Tell me more about the book. So you wrote. So your brother died, and you decided.
And
that
he charged me to write the book. That was his final words.
Wow. Okay.
So it became a personal issue. And I had to do it. Even though I had other things to do, I had to do it because it was an important matter, not only for us, but for our entire community, for all the black race. When a city tells you that they are not going to obey the United States Supreme Court, in fact, they're not going to obey the law. So what we're living under, I define as tyranny. Tyranny is when a government refuses to obey the law. And that's what the city of Los Angeles tells us. So now all this talk about they're trying to empower black people, that's just junk. It's just a lie. They have never tried to empower black people, and they fought every step of the way. We did not ask them to put up one dime for what we wanted to do. We were prepared to invest $50 million in the South Central community, which would have been the largest private non-real estate investment in that community ever. But they refused to allow it to happen. So for 10 years, black people in South Central were denied the right to access technology. And that access and lack of access has filtered through to the internet and everything else that goes on. So we couldn't educate our children because the schools were not doing a good job. There were problems in South LA about crime and gangs, and the children could not get the proper education. So instead of us being able to provide that additional and supplemental education through the cable system, we were denied the right. And the community was denied access to what everybody else in the city had, cable television. That was the technology of the 1980s, and we were locked out of it by the LA city government.
And so since then, let me ask this. When you were trying to get this licensing through Mayor Tom Bradley, was Tavis Smiley on his staff at that time, or he had not joined?
No, he wasn't.
Okay. And so since then...
And I've done interviews with Tavis, so I know Tavis. I've done interviews with Tavis. He's been kind enough to have me on interviews on his NPR show.
Wonderful, wonderful. So he understands what took place?
Absolutely. And part of the problem is when you see BET, BET came in and they had all sorts of informational programming like Tavis. But after a few years, they decided we're not going to have this kind of programming, which is useful to the community. We're going to have music videos and repeat movies and things like that.
Right.
So they terminated all the original programming they were doing with people like Tavis Smiley. And Tavis went to NPR, but a lot of it was simply lost. And we, again, didn't have access to the information that we should have had access to that we had the people who were willing to tell us.
Wow. Was Mr. Bradley still living when you wrote the book, Anatomy of a Hustle?
No, he wasn't.
Okay. And have you ever had any more dealings with Danny Bakewell or tried to get any?
No, and I had no problem with Danny. Danny was a businessman. He had every right to pursue whatever opportunities he had through the government, through his political connection. I did have a problem with Bob Farrell and Dave Cunningham being elected officials in the city of Los Angeles, coming to me and my brother and telling us unless we gave their friends some of our money and some of our company, that we couldn't do business. And it wasn't acceptable. I didn't accept it when I was a kid in New York, and I wouldn't accept it here. I don't accept extortion. I've been extorted by better people than them, believe me.
Right. And so Anatomy of a Hustle tells the story of the racism you faced from a city that was predominantly controlled by black people at that time.
From my standpoint. But it was important because, the book is really designed to give you a play-by-play of how institutional and systemic racism is perpetrated upon a community. We tell you step by step exactly how they did it. The pretense of hearings. We had hearings at the Department of Transportation, sub-council meetings, subcommittee hearings, meetings at the council. It's all just a game. They don't really they have their minds made up when they walk in the room. And so this thing about thinking that the fact that we had all the money in the world didn't mean anything. They said, you can't, just the fact of having money, we don't like your program. That's the whole purpose of a First Amendment. We don't need you to like our programming.
Right.
Our programming is designed to serve the communities that we are providing service to. And that was the minority community of South Central Los Angeles. We also filed applications in Compton and Inglewood, and they were so corrupt, it was even more corrupt than LA. They weren't big enough for us to sue.
Right.
So they didn't have the resources that we went after the biggest player in the game. But Compton simply took our application and never even bothered to look at it. When they decided our application wasn't acceptable in Compton, they gave us back a box that they had sealed when we filed it, and the box was still sealed.
Wow.
They had never even looked at it.
Wow.
Inglewood did the same thing. They just said, hey, we don't care who you are. We're not going to give you a license under any condition. Because one license was a monopoly. And you can't have a monopoly in cable television because it was like newspaper. Cable became the new newspaper.
Right.
As cable television grew, newspapers declined. So the public right-of-ways that newspapers had used to put their newspapers on each corner, cable television was using a wire right-of-way. We were denied the access to that right-of-way to service our own community. We weren't servicing Beverly Hills, and we didn't think people in Beverly Hills knew the problems of South Central and therefore couldn't properly address them. It wasn't racism, it's simply a lack of knowledge.
And they kept saying that they didn't like your programming. What was your programming?
Our program was heavily into education. Education, medical classes, financial services, things that would give people information they didn't have. And it didn't matter what it was. They said, basically, we didn't like your programming because we didn't like you. And that was simply a position they could take because it was subjective. The amount of money we had was not subjective. We had the top investment banking firms in the world providing capital. But then they said, you can't use investment banking firms if you're doing business here. Who ever heard of such a thing? All the industry was using investment banking. They said, you have to go to a commercial bank and get a loan. That's ridiculous.
Wow.
I was in investment banking, and the investment banking firms agreed to give us the $50 million, less the $10 million we were going to provide in equity capital. And we had the investors, and we identified the investors for the city all the time, up and down the road. But they said that's not, they could never complain about how much money we had.
Right.
That was not their complaint. It was about, they didn't like the system we were building. They didn't like the programming that we had. They didn't like where we located our public access studios.
Wow.
These sort of things that are nebulous and really you can't really complain about because they don't know what's going to happen. They held the applications for years.
Right.
And so how can things be the same 2-3 years later than they were when we filed the application?
Right. Wow. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to have him back very soon to talk about the other book. What did you think would happen? You've been watching Mr. Clinton Galloway on Yes We Can podcast with Pastor Sherman D.Manning. Mr. Galloway, I'm going to have you back very, very, very soon. Ladies and gentlemen, please remember that you can make a difference in your community. We can do it together. Yes, we can.
I know we can make it work. I know we can make it if we try. Great gosh, almighty, we can make it, y'all.